if you've followed what Antifa and Black Lives Matter have done over the last year, and especially if you followed even longer than that, there's a fellow named Andy No who manages to keep popping up in these places with the camera or finding someone who does and giving it life and saying, here's exactly what's going on. And I got to tell you, it's one thing to hear what Antifa's up to. It's another thing altogether to watch it. It's frightening. I mean, honestly, in many cases, it is frightening. And he goes into the belly of the beast. Well, Andy has written a book. It's called Unmasked, Inside Antifa's Radical Plan to Destroy Democracy. And I don't think that's an overstatement. The book hit yesterday, and it is the most talked about book in America today. And as I told him before we began our discussion, I think the best thing for him is the left is trying so hard to silence this book. Andy, what is it about you that drives them so crazy?
Because I've been covering them for several years now, I really understand their ideology and what they're really about. So they view me as a threat because they have relied on propaganda talking points in the legacy mainstream media and also left-wing politicians to whitewash and mislead the public about what this violent extremist movement actually is. They fooled so many people into thinking these are anti-fascists opposing white supremacists and neo-Nazis, when instead they're an insurrectionary, far-left, violent, terroristic movement who calls for the political assassinations of their political opponents, who carries out acts of mass destruction, such as setting fires to buildings when people are still inside, as they've done day after night in Portland, riots that are still ongoing to this day, by the way.
You know, one of the I guess we all have a thought as to who these people are, where they come from, how they went there. For 99.9% of us, we'll never meet one. Hopefully, we'll never come in contact with them. But what are the misconceptions that people have about these people? Who are they really?
It's probably one of the biggest misconceptions is that these are unorganized, grassroots, spontaneous actions on the street, peaceful protests on the street against the far right, when I've been reporting on them for many years, have been undercover around them. You see, as you read my book, that when they recruit members to some of these Antifa organizations, which are linked to one another in networks, they teach them really extreme radical ideology to radicalize them over weeks and months. They teach them how to take up arms. They teach them how to make homemade weapons. It's no surprise that in addition to guns and knives and bats and crowbars that were brought to the riots in Portland and Seattle throughout last year, that some of the other weapons included homemade IEDs. These led to very serious injuries on federal and local law enforcement, and the entire Democrat class establishment were at best silent and at worst coddling and encouraging these extremist rioters and calling the law enforcement Trump's Gestapo and secret police.
One of the things you talk about in the book is you've got interviews with former followers of the group. So unlike almost anyone else, including in media, you're actually talking to people who have left the group about why they got in and what they did when you got there. We all need to read this book because we need to be prepared. It's called Unmasked, Inside Antifa's Radical Plan to Destroy Democracy. It's by Andy No, N-G-O. The G is silent, obviously. What did you learn from them that surprised you from the former members, Andy?
So I've been speaking out and trying to warn the public about Antifa since going back to 2017, a long time before it was on the radar of a lot of people's minds. But even I underestimated them. So in the course of researching and documenting things for Unmasked, I never actually thought that they could, for example, take and claim territory as a sovereign city-state, if you will, and get the blessing of local city officials. So I'm talking about the CHAZ, the Capitol Hill Autonomous Zone, which was set up near downtown in Seattle last year for more than 3 weeks by Antifa and BLM extremists. When they went there, they made the police evacuate from the station, abandon it. Then they took over this entire area, which, by the way, houses thousands and thousands of families and just regular residents. They created a hostage situation, essentially. They created a hard border that was manned by checkpoints and those carrying guns and other weapons openly. And this was allowed to go on for 3 weeks. And if you may recall, the response from the mayor of Seattle at that time was that this could become a summer of love.
Right. Very disturbing. Were the members of Antifa surprised that they didn't get more resistance, that they could go this? Because it almost seemed at a certain point that they were thinking, wow, we never expected to get away with this. What do we do now? We got to keep ratcheting it up.
Absolutely. For example, the more than 120 days of riots that happened in Portland, the starting point was not the same as every other day. It originally started with creating an occupation outside one of the courthouses, and that quickly became sort of a base of operations. And then from there was crowdfunding for riot gear, for money for accommodation and food and weapons. And then you eventually saw them handing out, as I witnessed, homemade explosives like candy to people at these protests, directing them, here, light this and throw it at the courthouse. Some of these people have been federally charged for throwing explosives inside the federal courthouse. They try to barricade it and set it on fire. So they're doing things like this because they were given the leeway to do so. The response from the local elected officials, not just in Portland, but countless of other Democrat-run cities, is that these are peaceful protesters expressing a collective grief over George Floyd. When what they were doing were hurting people, destroying livelihoods, and in one case in Portland, actually killing somebody, shooting him in cold blood.
Well, and as you've noted, this preceded George Floyd, or any of the other things to which they attach a tag. I saw an interview you did with Lou Dobbs. I saw an interview you did with Tucker Carlson. I can't remember which of these it was, but you made the point in there, and maybe it was Lou Dobbs asked you, why is this happening in the Pacific Northwest? Could you speak to that? Because it really seemed an area that we would have least expected, and you basically said, no, you should have seen this coming.
It's because the Pacific Northwest, crucially, is a left-wing political monoculture. And when I say that, I mean that there's really no conservative or Republican or right-wing political presence there in any meaningful form. So there are blue-dominated cities like, let's say, New York or LA, but these cities are really big, and the pockets of the conservative constituents do add up to something, even if they don't necessarily win elections. Whereas in Portland, they have no voice at all. So there's no mechanism in place to moderate on the left and the far left. The left just gets pushed further and further to the far left. In November, there was an election for the mayoral race in Portland. Ted Wheeler, which was the mayor before, was running again against somebody who called herself an Antifa candidate, openly expressed support for what the Antifa were doing, refused over and over to condemn their acts of terrorism. And she only lost to Ted Wheeler by a few points, and only because there was a further candidate to her left running. So there is a critical mass in these cities politically who support the actions of the violent extremists. And if you speak out, if you dare to oppose them, such as I have, they show up at your home, they release your address, they threaten to kill you, they beat you, as they've done to me, they gave me a brain hemorrhage and almost killed me. I've had to flee Portland. And all of this is reported to law enforcement and, when applicable, the FBI, but nothing is done. This is a breakdown of the rule of law. And as the DOJ said last year, absolutely, these are anarchist jurisdictions.
The book is Unmasked, Inside Antifa's Radical Plan to Destroy Democracy by Andy Ngo, NGO. Andy, why do you think the politicians are afraid of them? Do you think some of it is there's an overlap in their Venn diagram of their beliefs and these people? Because they've attacked Ted Wheeler, they've attacked in Portland, they've attacked Jenny Durkin in Seattle. The mayor of Minneapolis was run out of a rally he showed up at to speak. These folks have even gone after the very people who were coddling them.
That's right. So it's all of the above that you just stated. The crossover in their shared political alliances is important in that Ted Wheeler, Jenny Durkin, all these other progressive Democrats viewed Trump as a fascist dictator and were essentially giving in to all the excesses of the far left because they had such a mutual hatred in the former administration. So they've fed and nurtured this beast and allowed what could have been controllable in the beginning to become now this monster that local law enforcement cannot get a handle of. Okay, and it's come back to bite them. As you mentioned, Ted Wheeler has been chased out of public places. He's been chased out of his home. He was forced to flee his home. He's been assaulted. The rioters showed up in front of the Mayor Jenny Durkin's home in Seattle. But, it's almost kind of like too little too late, even if these weak leaders come out against Antifa now. They've already allowed them to build up the apparatus and the structures to continue the violence long after these politicians leave office.
Andy, you went undercover at the occupied zone, and you spent a lot of time among these people watching how they act when their guard is down. You talk in the book about the way they indoctrinate people, which is their recruitment technique, which almost sounds like a terror cell. Or, well, I guess technically it is a terror cell. What are they saying? What kind of people are prone to be lured into these groups? I'm assuming they're disaffected types. But what types of people, where do they go to recruit them, to find them? And then how do they feed them to kind of lure them in and make them into their soldiers? What is that process?
Great question. So I've been documenting the around 1,000 arrests that have happened throughout the riots last year in Portland. And I've looked into the backgrounds. And there really is not one mold of who these accused rioters at these Antifa violent protests are. They include people in white-collar professions such as academics, registered nurses, attorneys, those who have families, people who you would think would have more important things to do than to engage in political violence. And then they also include, as you said a moment ago, disaffected people, vagrants, those who are dealing with mental health issues, very vulnerable members of our society. So what readers will understand once they look in Unmasked, my book, is that I've actually had some primary documents that are published for the first time showing how one Antifa group, the largest one in America, Rose City Antifa in Portland, how they actually radicalize and train their new members. It is a radicalization process like you would see in a jihadist group. You don't get somebody who goes from, let's say, a hard leftist activist to somebody who is willing to take up arms and kill and be martyred without there being lots of steps in between. So in this curriculum, the role of the literature is very important because they introduce ideas incrementally about why they need to break windows, why they need to stop fires, why they need to kill and attack law enforcement. They provide a whole theoretical, ideological explanation for everything. When these new recruits are being indoctrinated in this process, they don't even see it for how extreme it is. To them, it's like, oh, I see how this makes sense. And they introduce them further and further and further to things ultimately that lead some of them to carry out deadly attacks.
How is this organization structured, Andy? I mean, it's an impressive thing that they can generate these crowds seemingly on short notice and have this kind of command and control ability to move them around. And these people are exposing themselves to potential harm, to potential arrest. I know it hasn't happened, but it could. To get these people this mobilized, they seem to be very organized. What does that structure look like? They
are extremely organized. So to get the details to the answers to your question, your listeners will have to read the book, but I'll give a little teaser. It doesn't involve just Antifa. There's a whole system in place where there are fellow travelers in media, in journalism, in big tech, in entertainment, in culture, all of these coming together to aid these extremists as they openly carry out and organize acts of terrorism on social media predominantly, but also through encrypted chat rooms. They hold various social events where they meet new potential recruits and introduce them to these extremist literatures and invite them to these secret meetings that they have. All of this is detailed in the book. All of us, including myself at one point, have underestimated how dedicated they are to destabilizing the republic. And if they need to, they will kill, as they have done.
And the funding for this, obviously George Soros' name is bandied about, but they seem to be very well funded. It's not cheap to carry out what they're doing. Where's this money coming from?
The money is coming from through crowdfunding, and this is a detail that's in the organizational structure. You asked me about misconceptions earlier in this interview. One misconception is that there's some billionaire or millionaire funding them. It doesn't work like that. They actually do their funding right in the open on GoFundMe, on Cash App, on Venmo. And the money they raise is not insignificant. I'm talking about in the millions. Money to buy things like riot gear, weapons, to pay for them to travel to different areas, to support their comrades in different cities, to paying for all their bail, to paying for their legal funds when they happen to get prosecuted, if they get prosecuted, I should say.
I am a big believer that society needs healthy dissent, and this is not healthy dissent. But within the realm of allowing for peaceful dissent and recognizing that this is an organization engaged in terror and violence, what is the answer? Be the king for a moment. How do we deal with this?
We deal by, actually enforcing the law. So we don't necessarily need a whole bunch of new legislation to address and confront what Antifa are doing. There's been, for example, RICO laws at the federal level to address criminal gangs, which is what Antifa is. The FBI and other federal authorities have the ability to break up some of these networks, to pressure social media, for example, to actually uphold the terms of service and not allow violent extremists and terrorists to fundraise on their platforms. But beyond all that, we're dealing with an issue where there's no political will to address it, because if you dare to oppose Antifa, you are accused of being pro-fascism, pro-racism. If you are against Black Lives Matter, the organization, then you're accused of being a racist. And there's really heavy costs, not just to politicians, obviously, but to individuals such as myself. So I'm not sure what it will take for us to come to our senses. I would think that the deaths of dozens of people at the riots, the destruction of so many lives and businesses, the wanton violence carried out in the open by these extremists, I thought that would have been enough for example, the media to wake up. But instead, what we've been told is these are mostly peaceful protests against racism.
Andy, I have a theory that when they spill out beyond Portland and Seattle and Minneapolis and Austin, and they get into smaller towns with more conservative law enforcement mayors, where folks are going to clash back with them, where folks are gun owners, that this thing turns violent, and that has a tendency to change how these things are perceived, which means that families start getting more involved and saying, wait a second, this group you're going out with, this is not harmless, this is not fun, you're not trick-or-treating. My suspicion is that's when something is going to be done about it.
I hope so, because judging by the statements of a lot of people in the public in areas like Portland or Seattle, they still think that Antifa is a movement for good, while these extremists are setting fires to the property of their neighbors.
Well, they're winning hearts and minds because they're getting folks to show up, and that disturbs me. Andy, speak to parents for a moment who have people in the age groups that are susceptible to this, and if I could get a better sense of what that is at 14 to 25, I don't know. How do you know when your kid is kind of beginning to tiptoe into this, dip a toe into these movements and interact with these and potentially even showing up at their events, your kid's off at college or whatever?
I would say the boundary that every Antifa militant has to cross is their willingness to embrace political violence. And if you see a family member or a loved one making posts on social media supporting the violent acts of BLM or other left-wing activists, that's a warning sign for one.
And finally, and I appreciate you taking so much time with us. This is very helpful, and I hope folks will buy it. Unmasked, Inside Antifa's Radical Plan to Destroy Democracy. What is their end goal? And where are they going with the use of violence? What should we expect to see next? And what do they want to accomplish at the end of all this? Do they know?
They do know. It's in their literature. For their utopia to materialize, for their world to thrive, America has to die. They're against the concept of nation states, all of them, but they view the United States of America as the principal imperialistic fascist force in the world that needs to be destroyed. So not reformed, not changed, destroyed. So there's a lot of symbolism in their acts of violence and destruction, not just in private property, but against courthouses, for example, police stations and all that. They view the United States as a force of wickedness in the world, a force of fascism, tied through this whole system of capitalism, protection of property. Even they view the protection of freedom of expression as also a form that enables fascism. So they attack not just the literal United States, but also its founding ideals that have been a force for good in the world and for other societies.
Very disturbing. I am so grateful. Most of us are stepping back and sitting in our air-conditioned rooms and watching what's going on television or on the internet, but you are actually out there on the streets interacting and then writing about it and telling the stories and sounding the clarion call to do something about it. I hope this book is read by a lot of people, and I hope it makes a difference. Listeners and in the halls of Congress and in law enforcement, the book is Unmasked, Inside Antifa's Radical Plan to Destroy Democracy by Andy Ngo, N-G-O. Great work. Please keep it up. You are a true patriot, Andy.